All right, thanks for coming out Saturday morning. Hope you had fun at the House of Balls last night, if you attended that. So this is Chasing the Dream of Style Guide-Driven Development in Drupal 8. Hopefully you were in the right place. Perhaps that person was not. So I'm Brian Perry. I work at a company called Breakthrough Technologies in the Chicago area, specifically Evanston. And this is where you can find me on Twitter and my Drupal.org username. Let's get moving. So, I guess a good thing to start with is what exactly is style guide-driven development. So we're going to focus a lot of the talk on the workflow that I've used and how this can fit in with what you might be doing on the front end in Drupal 8. But first, let's level set a little bit. So from my perspective, style guide-driven development is the decoupling of front-end and back-end development. So you can do things like define the look and feel of things on your site before the functionality completely exists. And what that opens up the door to is the concept that theming doesn't have to come last. I know that I've experienced this. I don't know if you guys have run into situations on projects where there's like a theming phase at the end, or like the perception that you can kind of come in at the end and clean things up and make things look nice. This is what the perception of that is that, right at the very end, you can handle the theme, make everything look just like the mock-ups, and cross the finish line right at the end, giving double medal signs. And it's not usually like that. It's usually a little bit more like this, where some stuff is going to get done, other things are not. Some people are going to fall and hurt themselves, and there might be that guy in the back left who's just leaning on a hurdle for some reason. I didn't even notice that until recently. Or there's the Mario Kart version of this, where you're just about at the finish line and you're going to get hit by a big blue shell. That reference usually works for about 2 people every time, so congratulations. A piece of the puzzle here is the idea of a living style guide. So this is a screenshot of a living style guide. This is the US Web Design Standards. You'll see that there's a menu on the left-hand side of different elements of the style guide and different components. And then there's a detail and description of what those things are, how you'd use them. So this is a search bar component from that same style guide. So there's a description of what a search bar is, a few different variations on presentations of search bars, and then down at the bottom, there's some markup that theoretically you should be able to use and plug in to make a search box look like these search boxes. Another kind of common early reference for a living style guide was Starbucks. They had a digital style guide. They were kind of early pioneers in that, and also delicious coffee. What makes a living style guide, or what makes a good living style guide from my perspective? It should be modular and reusable, the components inside of it. So this is a screenshot of a blog post from Brad Frost about introducing the concept of atomic design. There's a quote from Stephen Hay up at the top. "We're not designing pages, we're designing systems of components." And that's something that when I first read that really clicked with me and makes a lot of sense. So this is how atomic design lays out the different kind of levels of components, and we can walk through that. But from my perspective, while this is an approach that makes sense to me, the bigger idea is just that you're looking at ways that you can break the things that you're building down into smaller, more reusable parts. So however you get to that framework works. But anyway, so the idea of an atom is kind of the smallest piece or component on your site, things like basic HTML elements, links, headers, things like that. A molecule is a slightly more complex grouping of those atoms. So the search box that we saw is a good example of that. There's a text box and a button combined together. And then an organism is a slightly more complicated combination of those previous components. So you might have something like a header that has your logo and some text and navigation and maybe a search box like we talked about. And then a template takes all of those components and lays them out in a unique way. A page, then, is a particular instance of a template that has content plugged into it. So again, kind of going back to that quote, the idea here is that you're not going to be designing individual pages. You design the templates and plug stuff into them. I know that I've certainly experienced a number of times being delivered like a Photoshop mock-up of a whole page. And what I find often happens in that case is that soon after you'll get another Photoshop mock-up of another page that's really the same template, but there are things that are different. Maybe some of the colors changed, or font sizes, or who knows. And if you really focus on defining the common templates and start from there, first of all, you shouldn't have to do more rework, but also it makes that conversation easier when you get some sort of representation. You can be like, oh, this is actually supposed to be the detail page template, but I notice these things are different. Is that on purpose? Is it not? So it helps. So your living style guide should use real-world CSS and markup. As we look at examples, we'll see the real-world CSS is actually pretty easy to do in practice, to use the same CSS that your website is using in your style guide. Using the real-world markup is a little bit more challenging, and we'll look at some examples and also some things that people in the community are doing now to try to bridge that gap, which is really cool. But as close as you can get to that, the better. Your living style guide always needs to be kept up to date, so it should be generated automatically somehow. You're probably going to have to, it's not magic, you're probably going to have to include some sort of documentation in your CSS, for example, to generate that. So you still have to keep up on it, but it should be something that anytime there's any change, your style guide just gets built automatically. If you don't do that, it pretty quickly becomes the same thing as or effectively the same thing as getting like a Photoshop style guide that's delivered to you on the first day of the project. Soon as that grows out of date, it's substantially less useful and doesn't reflect reality. And also, your living style guide can be testable. So this is my fancy infomercial gift slide. Has this ever happened to you? There were so many awesome options for infomercial fail gifts. That's a good one. Another one I like, it was a guy, he was on his couch and he had a drink in one hand and a bowl of popcorn in the other, and he tries to pick up a remote control and he drops them both. That was my second choice. But has this ever happened to you? One tiny CSS change causes a regression deep in the outer reaches of your site. Who knows when you pick up on it? Maybe it just goes and lives on. It's something that's definitely happened to me. And if you have this sort of framework where you're defining the pieces of the puzzle and putting them in a style guide, you have some tools so you can actually test and protect yourself from those types of regressions. So this is an example of a visual regression test where we have a baseline image for a particular component on the site, and we're comparing the current state, and we get a screenshot comparison diff that shows us what changed. So it'd be pretty easy to tell that, obviously in this case, it's the content that changed and also the style of the text. But it makes it a lot easier to pin it down to a particular component and figure out where things went wrong. So, overview stuff. Let's see if we can get to the Drupals already. We will, and then we'll also get out of them again. But so in Drupal 8, there's been a lot of great changes to the theming system. And one of the kind of feelings that I walk away as I continue to learn more about it is that Drupal 8 wants us to build better themes with cleaner markup that are easier to work with. And that's awesome, and that fits into this workflow quite nicely. So there's definitely has been a lot done in Drupal 8 to make it easier to output cleaner markup. There's a couple of base themes, classy and stable, that both are much more stripped down in comparison to the markup that Drupal 7 would typically output. So classy is kind of the reasonable or sane amount of markup for a base theme, and stable is kind of the absolute bare minimum as far as classes and markup that's included. And in Drupal 8, you have to use a base theme, and if you don't, it'll default to stable unless you explicitly say, I think it's base theme equals false in your YAML file. But you should have a base theme. There's definitely also been a lot of focus on separating the logic, the clearly separating logic between logic and display. So Drupal 8 uses Twig for the templating system, and something like adding a class in the past. Oftentimes there'd be cases where that would have to happen in pre-processing. So you would have to go search to find where that class is being added, and it prevents people from being able to do more work in just the templates. Now, Twig and Drupal's version of Twig has some cases where you can set up and define the classes right in the template. So there's a little bit of logic here to set what the class is, and then a method that adds that class. And then also you can do little simple bits of logic too. You can test to see if a class exists, and then change the markup based on that. And oftentimes these were examples that would have to happen in pre-processing or some hook. And all of that stuff now is nice and easily accessible and readable in the Twig templates. So there's also a handful of tools and tricks and standards to help you lead in the direction of creating more modular, reusable components. So some of that even just goes down to the coding standards that are used in Drupal 8. So SMAX is a kind of a framework for organizing your CSS partials, your SAS partials in this case, or your CSS partials. So this is how the 7 theme uses this concept. So there's the idea of base styles. So things like a reset style sheet could go in here, or things related to kind of simple top-level HTML elements. And then there's layout. So that's again how things are organized on the page. Your grid system would go in there. And then there's also the component, and that's also where you'll find often that a lot of the meat of the styling lives. SMAX calls that a module, which as somebody who works with Drupal, you might find familiar. So that's called a component by us typically. And then there's also the state, so that's a different variation on a component, perhaps after that component has been interacted with. And then what they call a theme, and we often call a skin, which is just a different kind of look and feel or presentation of a component, for example. But drilling in at the level of the component, there's also the BEM, block element modifier naming convention. So block is the thing, and then the component in this case. And then that component might have a number of different elements inside of it. And the idea is that those elements would be unique to this particular block. And then you can have a modifier that modifies either the block or any of those elements. And this is the naming convention for that. So there'd be a double underscore before an element, and then a double hyphen for a modifier. And you can even have something like a block element that is then modified. But this structure, it definitely leads you in the direction of defining these things more explicitly in ways that are a little bit easier to kind of pick up and reuse, which is a good thing. So this is just an example, again, in the 7 theme of that convention being used. So the block here is a pager. and then there is the pager item element, and then there are next, last, first, and previous modifiers for it. Twig, in the Twig templates, another thing that you can do that is useful when you're thinking about how you can make things more reusable is the concept of Twig extends. So let's say this is the field.html.twig template. Let's say that what we wanted to do was wrap the content in different markups. So maybe we wanted to make that H1s. In the past, what we'd have to do is we'd have to take the whole field template and everything inside of it and make that change, and then have suggestions that pick up on the right template when we need it. So now instead, something that we can do with Twig is we can, so here we're taking the default field.html.twig template and creating our own copy of that in our theme that is going to replace the default one. And for the things that we want to change, we just define blocks. So here I defined, in this case, different blocks for if it's multiple values or single values. But you just wrap in block and end block here. And then once you do that, you can extend that template. So here where we want to just wrap the content in H1s, we create our own template for, in fact, this specific field. And then we extend field.html.twig, and all we have to do is redefine the blocks and not include everything else that's in that template. So that's a nice way to not repeat ourselves and reuse things in a way that we couldn't easily do in the past. Okay. So let's look at some of the ways that you can actually create a style guide. All right, so this is a little video of the style guide module. Technically, this is the Drupal 7 style guide module. But if you haven't used the style guide module or aren't familiar with it, it's worth mentioning and introducing. So it's a module that you can enable that lists out a number of common HTML elements and a number of common Drupal components and lays them all out in your theme so you can see what they look like. You can switch between your themes and see what all of these things would look like in different themes. It's a nice, really easy way to obviously see these things all laid out, but also get a feel for, like, if you're in the middle of theming something, what's done, what's not done, what's left to come. And then also it has an API with some nice hooks. There's the style guide hook. So that allows you to actually insert things into a style guide. If you're a module that has a particular component, you could define that and add it into the style guide. And then there's also hook style guide alter, which lets you change any of the data that's being sent to style guide. So, for example, just a really simple example, you could create your own custom button styles or color swatches and include that stuff in your style guide. And something also that I've done a little bit in the past is use the alter to change the labeling and grouping of things to give a feel for the things that we've already talked about and kind of finalize their styling for versus the things that are still being worked on. So there's cool little tricks like that. The style guide module, there's a port of it in progress for Drupal 8, so it's not quite ready to go and needs your help. But with or without style guide, again, I think it's a useful tool for Drupal. But with or without style guide, kind of my workflow has evolved a little bit, partially because style guide still isn't completely ready for prime time. But using a style guide generator that isn't really tied with Drupal, and there are a bunch of options for these things. So one is Pattern Lab, and Pattern Lab is something that's tied pretty closely to that atomic design concept. So it's really great at giving you a way to build components that contain other components inside of them, as that's a big piece of atomic design. It's been a little while since I've used Pattern Lab, and when I first tried to use it, it didn't really, for me, play all that nicely or easily with Drupal. I know that it's evolved, and a lot of other people have had good experience with it, and people are trying to find better ways for it to play nice and talk to Drupal, so it's something that I plan on looking at repeatedly in the future. This list also kind of evolves for me whenever I reference it as to what I've heard the most recently. So at DrupalCon, like in a BOF on this topic, another generator that I heard a lot was Hologram. A lot of these are very similar, but Hologram is a Ruby gem. And knowing that it's a Ruby gem, that might even tell you whether or not it's something that you'd be interested in using. And then the one that I have used and continue to use is KSS. So KSS stands for Nile Style Sheets. It provides human-readable documentation syntax for your CSS. It can be any flavor of CSS, your plain Jane vanilla CSS, your Sass. There's a Node.js implementation of it, which is actually one of the maintainers is John Albin, who is very much involved in the Drupal community, so it's nice having a Drupal-friendly person maintaining this. And there's a nice grunt plugin for this as well, so you can tie it into your workflow so that your style guide gets automatically generated when things change. So how one would install this, and the parentheses there, when I gave this talk at MidCamp, Morten DK was politely, quietly sitting in the front row, as he often does, but he, at this point, burst out to let me know that there was a module for this. And there is a Drupal KSS module, but I would say at this point, it needs more work and more attention to really be fully useful for the workflow. So right now, there's a module for this, but it happens to be a node package. At least that's how I use it. So you can install KSS, and then also the Grunt plugin for KSS if you use Grunt as a task manager. So let's look at an example. So this is a section of the Breakthrough Technologies website that has solutions. And these are actually taxonomy terms. It's a view, and the taxonomy terms themselves, the actual, these are like teasers for the taxonomy terms. So if we were to define this as like what sort of component it is, it might be the solutions teaser. And there's the thumbnail image. There's a H4 for the title, and then the text description below it. So let's say that we wanted to document something like this in our KSS style guide. This is what that might look like. So it's just a doc block, basically, above the related piece of CSS. So we call this the solution teaser, give it a name, and then we can provide a description for it. And then the markup entry, so that can reference a file that contains the markup for this component. That can be HTML in handlebars format, and it can also, as of recently with KSS, be in Twig, which is awesome. You can also include the markup inline if it was something really simple, but that gets kind of unwieldy kind of fast. And then the style guide entry at the bottom just defines exactly where in the style guide this lives, what section and what it should be called. So in building the style guide, so I use Grunt, so I would run Grunt KSS, or I would make that part of my watch task, which we'll see in a second. But if you were to just run KSS node, that's what the command would look like, and it's helpful to break this down to kind of understand what goes into it. So you provide the source, so what Sass files in this case is it going to look through to find these documentation blocks and then generate the style guide out of. Destination is where that's going to go. So in this case, I'm building it in a style guide subdirectory in my theme. So you can actually go and look at the style guide. You could create some sort of alias for that path so that it would be easier for people to see if you wanted to make that style guide publicly available. And then for CSS, you're telling it a CSS file to include in the style guide. So that's how we're making sure that the style guide actually uses the actual legitimate CSS file that we're building for our site. And when you do that, you would get something that looks like this. So there's a little menu on the left-hand side, and in the solution section, we have the solutions teaser, our little description. It renders the component, and then below, there's markup that you could use to create something that looks like this. It's not the prettiest markup, but it's markup. So before we talk about testing, let's actually look at a quick example. Demo. As they say, always do live demos. Okay, so going back to the solutions teaser that we looked at, let's say just for the sake of demonstrating this, we decide that today for Drupal Camp in Twin Cities, it makes sense that we're going to make the H4s here big and purple. A lot of purple color scheme going on around here. So let's say that we wanted to make that change. So I'm going to get grunt going so that it's watching for changes. And then here, in my fonts partial, I already have this documented H4, but let's say that we want to make it big and purple. And we're going to just say that it's big and purple for Drupal Camp. And when we save that, it's regenerating our Sass. And it very quickly built the style guide. Here it went through all of the Sass partials. It built out the KSS style guide, and then it cleared our cache. So if we go and reload the page here and take a look at our solutions section, it's now big and purple, and slightly broken, but big and purple. And if we look at the style guide, go over to the heading section and take a look at H4. It's updated in the style guide, and it's also big and purple. And perhaps if we look at that, we'll reconsider what we did. Okay. So we'll let Grunt take a break here. All right, so that's one example of generating a style guide. So now let's talk about, so I can get this to go away. Yeah. Let's talk about testing your style guide and theme, this framework that we've developed. Okay. So this is another thing where I've tried a bunch of options. So I'll talk you through all the things that I've tried and kind of what I landed on. So BHAT is a behavior-driven development framework that a lot of people in the Drupal community use. At Breakthrough, we use this to functionally do functional testing on a lot of our projects. It's great. So where I started to try to have some coverage for the more look and feel things is to see if this could be done in BHAT. And we developed some custom steps to try to address this sort of thing. There's the step that's when I'm browsing using a phone. So that just uses a variable that actually defines a browser dimensions. And then there's rules that we created to actually test computed CSS values. And maybe there are other ways to get at this, but this really was kind of the closest that we could get within this framework. And I found really quickly, you get to the point where you're basically writing out all of your CSS rules in your tests, and it's crazy overkill. And also because it's the computed values, those would tend to drift pretty easily. So for example, if you had a scroll bar on a page that maybe wasn't there before, the values would be a little bit off. So it was problematic. But it might be a trick that could be useful in some cases, depending on what your tests are. The slides, I'll tweet out the slides. They're up on GitHub. But there's a link to a gist that has the detail of some of these steps, if anybody's curious. But basically, what I learned is that this is not the right home for this type of testing. And then there's other tools that are more specific to like visual regression and screenshot comparison. So that's where I went and focused my efforts. One of those is Wraith. And Wraith kind of falls into the same category as Pattern Lab for me. Well, when I first tried it, it didn't really do exactly what I was looking for it to do. But I've heard a number of people who use it well, and it's kind of evolved recently. So I always plan on trying to go back to it and see what has changed. But screenshot comparison tool, it was developed by the team at the BBC. And at least in its kind of default state, what it does is it compares to URLs that you provide. It can go out and crawl those two URLs, create screenshots, and compare them, and show you a visual representation if there is a diff. And what it did by default, at least when I last used it, is it was typically going to give you an all or nothing, like full page screenshot, which is great for like a really baseline warning that, hey, something went wrong, but not quite as useful to try to find out exactly what that thing is. Because if you have some sort of change or regression that happens at the top of a full page screenshot, it's really common that everything below it is going to end up as a diff. So it might be that at that point is where something changed, and you can start there, but also within that kind of cloudy diff, there could be other things that were regressions. But I believe that Wraith can do more now as far as testing against a local baseline, so you don't have to test against like 2 live sites. And there's also more that you can do as far as targeting individual components on a page. So that's definitely more in line with what I'm looking for one of these tools to do. It also generates a nice little report that shows you the screenshots it took and the diff. So instead of Wraith, something that I was using for a while is Phantom CSS for CSS regression testing. It also does that screenshot comparison. And it has a handful of components packaged together. So it uses Phantom.js or Slimer.js as a headless browser, Casper.js for navigation and scripting, and Resemble.js for screenshot comparison. And what this did nicely, so specifically I used the Grunt plugin for it. So it fit really nicely into my workflow and was super easy to install, whereas some of these tools that hasn't really been the case when they have so many different components. But it's also really easy to script interactivity into your tests, and easier to target components as well. So you would basically just provide a selector, and it would take a screenshot of that thing. But the Phantom CSS itself, the Grunt version, and also, I believe, Casper.js aren't really frequently maintained anymore. So there's always the thing in the back of my mind that it might be time to find something similar, but that's a little bit more active. And so the thing that I landed on is recently, after talking to a bunch of people on this topic at DrupalCon New Orleans to see what people are using, is WebDriver IO. So I recently tried to convert some of my tests to use this. It is really similar in what it can do to what I was familiar with Phantom. But WebDriver IO is a set of Selenium bindings for Node.js. So it drives Selenium, and then WebDriver CSS is something that provides that sort of screenshot comparison regression testing. And it kind of has the same strengths that Phantom did. So let's take a look at what a test for that would look like. So this is how you would install it. You install all the, again, a node package, and you install all the individual pieces. And a lot of this stuff is evolving. So this is a case where to get these things to all play nicely together, right now there are specific versions you should be using. There's a new version of WebDriver IO, but it doesn't work with WebDriver CSS, and all great stuff like that. And then after installing these pieces, you need to install Selenium standalone so you can run Selenium. And then after you do that, this is what the basic structure of a test would look like. So we'll just go over this at kind of a high level. So you need to pull in the things that you need, require WebDriver IO and WebDriver CSS. And if you want to be able to have a test that fails if something is wrong, you need to have a library to do assertions. And then you can pass some options to WebDriver IO to dictate what browser it should be using. I believe it can use Chrome, Firefox, or Safari. And also Phantom.js, which is nice in that, since it's completely headless, you could run as part of easily as part of like a continuous integration process. So it doesn't actually have to have a browser that actually pops up and does stuff. At the same time, it's also nice to be able to see these things happen in a browser that pops up and does stuff. So that sort of level of options is nice. And then you define the browser, and then you pass that browser into your instance of WebDriver CSS, and you can provide some options there. So here I'm just saying where the screenshots are going to show up. And then this is actually a function that I got out of some walkthroughs of how these tests can be created. It's on a gist somewhere, which actually just handles the assertion for the screenshots. So it walks through all the screenshots that were created, compares them to the baseline, and if it doesn't hit a specific mismatch tolerance, it throws an exception. So with all that stuff out of the way, here's like the actual steps of a test. So after you initialize the browser, you can specify a page that it would go to. And in this particular example, I would probably want to make the URL something that's configurable, so it's a lot easier if people are using it on their local environments, that sort of stuff. But say what page it should go to, and then you define essentially like a section or a group of screenshots that you want to take, and then you can pass them the screenshots through by providing a name for the screenshot, and that will actually result in the file name that the screenshot gets saved with, and then a selector for the element that you're trying to capture a screenshot of. And then we also have the callback that it should assert these screenshots. And then, so the second test on the breakthrough site, it has a piece of off-canvas navigation. So just to show like a super simple example of interactivity, like if we wanted to actually capture a screenshot of the off-canvas menu, we'd have to click it to expose it first before we took our screenshot. So how we would do that is, WebDriver IO has a number of things you can do to script interactivity. A super simple one is click. So you just provide the selector of the thing you want to click, and it clicks it. And then after that's done, we can take screenshots of the off-canvas navigation. So going back to the same solution teaser component that we've been talking about, this is what that screenshot would look like after it captures it. Okay, so now let's take a look at an example of this in practice. So again, let's remember that we made the really smart move of making all of these titles big and purple. So if we were to run a test now, I cleared out all of the baselines just so we can see what the initial state would look like. So first we'll get Selenium running. There we go. Okay. And now we have this test that we walked through, so we should be able to run the JavaScript file that contains the test. And here it pops up an instance of Chrome. What WebDriver does is for the page that you're taking the individual component screenshots of, it generates a screenshot of the entire page, and then it breaks out the components from that. So that's why you see it kind of traversing the whole page. So now that test is run, we're going to see in our screenshots directory, we have a baseline image for the solution teaser that has our big purple text. And we also grabbed an example of that off-canvas navigation as well. So let's say that we have the completely reasonable reaction that maybe it's later enough on a Saturday morning and we're like, maybe that shouldn't be big and purple anymore. So if we made that change, get grunt going again, we'll go into our stats file and we'll take out this bit that it's big and purple now, and we'll take out those rules, save our file, and now we'll see that it's going to regenerate our CSS, it's going to regenerate our style guide. We should be able to go to the site and confirm that that's true. Cool, no more big and purple there, no more big and purple here. So now, let's see what happens when we run our test again, because something did change. As you would imagine, this should fail for specifically the solutions teaser component. And if we jump over here, we see that it did notice a mismatch. And so it still has the baseline here. It also saves a screenshot of the regression. So this is what it looks like now without the big and purple. And then in the diff folder, we see that screenshot comparison diff that we were talking about before. So it's the baseline images that you'd want to save in your repository so people can compare against them. And you wouldn't want to necessarily include the diffs or the regressions or things like that. So we've gone through this process and we've defined these components on our site and we have some test coverage for them. So I find that this is a real nice tool to be able to tell when there's a regression and easily pinpoint what thing changed and what's been affected by it. Yeah. Okay. Let's see. So let me shut off some of my stuff here. It doesn't have to be working anymore. Cool. Okay. So this talk is called, it has the incredibly catchy title of Chasing the Dream of Style Guide-Driven Development in Drupal 8. Why did I call it that? Definitely not because it was a really catchy title. It's because, as you've seen, even some of the stuff that I've talked about and walked through, my workflow for this and finding the right tools and a reliable way to do this process has been evolving, and I feel like it's still evolving. So that's a big part of it. And then also within the Drupal community recently, I feel like there's been a lot of attention around some of these topics. If you were at DrupalCon New Orleans or saw the Dries note online, the number one front-end related initiative is this thing called the Component-Based Rendering Initiative. And that is the whole idea of trying to find ways to create these reusable components that we've been talking about more easily in a more Drupal-y way. And maybe even doing things like having a way that you can have Drupal generate a style guide. So it's really exciting that a lot of people are thinking about that, and that there's a work going on there. And I think that if we can find a reliable way to do that, I think it's really going to make Drupal a great place to do this type of component-based design and implementation. And then another thing that we talked about a little bit is that whole idea of, we mentioned for your living style guide, you want it to be using the real-world CSS and markup. One thing that's always been difficult is making sure that the markup that is in your style guide is actually, or is as close to as possible as the markup that is in Drupal. And that's another thing that I think people have been looking at a lot of options to how you might achieve that. So, in the past, sometimes it's only been as good as you're able to include the markup in the style guide and say, please use that. And, so there's some amount of liquidity there. So, yeah, people have been looking at ways that we can actually get the style guide to use the same markup as Drupal. There was a session in DrupalCon specifically around how that can be done with Pattern Lab. Man, I have, that got, like, when they demoed that, like, ridiculous applause. Like, I expect people to be, like, throwing flowers up on the stage. But for me, I'm not using Pattern Lab. It's not quite part of my workflow. Also, the process, maybe it's because I haven't been hands-on with it. Maybe I didn't get it. I don't know. But it seemed a little complicated, and there were things being kind of copied around, and it wasn't really, to me, that like literally using the same file, the same stuff, but still way closer. Another thing, also as part of the whole component-based rendering initiative that people are looking at, John Albin in the Zen Theme, and I think we have enough time to go into this a little bit, has, now that KSS can use Twig and read Twig when it generates the style guide, he's been looking at ways that you might be able to, again, use that same markup. And in the most recent version of the Zen Theme for Drupal 8, he's defined components that do exactly that. So I've been playing around with this, again, just trying to keep chasing with everybody else and see where things are going. And I don't know, it took a second to kind of figure out what the approach is, but the more I think about it, the more it makes sense. I think there's a lot that we have to do to make this something that really truly works with Drupal, but the concept is interesting to me. So here's basically what it is, and there are a few other approaches that do the same sort of idea, but as opposed to the model view controller approach, there's also something called the model view presenter approach, and what you have is, in between the model and the view, you have something called the presenter that, at just the simplest level, is a middleman that's going to be translating things. So in a situation where there's stuff that Drupal expects and stuff that Drupal passes to templates, it could do some translation as far as what, for example, your style guide does and doesn't need when it's actually generating the markup. So what does that actually look like is a great question. So let's take a second and look at that. So we'll look at a couple of things here. So one is, what is Zen doing? And then the other thing that, in trying to follow along with this, I asked myself, could I do this in my own theme? And we'll find out. Where to start? So the idea here is that, so in Zen, where are we? Just got to remember the alphabet, that's all it is. In Zen, there is now, in the Zen starter kit, there's a components subfolder that also has, I don't know why it's structured like this, but also a component subfolder that contains components. But they're definitely components. And if we look at, for example, the messages component here, so the idea here is that in this component, it has all of the things that you need to build this message. So there's the Twig template, there's Sass, there's the JSON file is actually just input to the style guide, so KSS can allow you to pass content in through JSON, which is really nice. There's even some SVG icons. You could have JavaScript in here as well, but the idea is that the component has everything to be able to render that thing, both for the style guide and for potentially Drupal. So how can Drupal be made aware of this? So if we go to the templates, dig up the right template here. Yeah, status messages. So again, there's that model view presenter idea that there's a middleman that is kind of doing some of the translation. So what's being done here is that in the traditional template that Drupal looks for, so in this case, status messages.html.twig, we actually, this is basically the presenter. So it sets up all of the things that Drupal needs to know, or it translates the Drupal-y things that the component needs to know about, and then it includes the component, the Twig template from the component. So again, the middleman. So to be able to do that, there's you'll see that there's that include starter kit components messages, messages.twig. That uses its own like twig namespace to go find that thing. There's actually a components module that allows you to define your own namespaces. So in the past, they would only look in certain places like templates in your theme. But the components module, what it allows you to do, and this is the related section in the themes info.yaml file, is specify some other places it will look for those twig templates and define a namespace for it. It's kind of weird to me that this module is called components. Seems like it does part of what you need for components, but useful nonetheless. So once we've done that, and again we define and pass along what Drupal-y things that the template needs to know about, the idea is that back in the component, this is mostly going to be the kind of vanilla twig. So the basic representation of your markup that's going to be used in your style guide. We are also, in this case, attaching a library so that you can have all of the different pieces that are necessary for the component. But beyond that, a lot of it is just kind of the default twig stuff. And then a problem that also comes up with this approach is that there are certain things that Drupal can do in twig templates that are Drupal things. So there needs to be some effort to either make it so that when those things happen in a template, it doesn't cause things to explode, or make something like KSS. And I think there's similar efforts with Pattern Lab to be able to handle those things as well. So KSS does some of that. So let's try to quickly look at an example of what that might look like if we did it in our own theme. So I just created a really simple subtheme. That's a subtheme of Bartik, and I added a quote field to the article content type. So here we have our quote that the party last night was at the House of Balls. So right now all it does is it just centers that component. And we have our style guide that just has the quote in it and the markup. So now if we go over to our walkthrough theme, sorry. So in templates here, similar concept where we're just kind of queuing up things and then including the component for the quote. And then in components, we have our quote component, where we have our twig template and some Sass. So let's say, sticking with our theme here, we'll get Grunt going again so that it can rebuild this stuff. Let's say that we want to make add some purple, basically, to that component, keeping with our purple theme. So we're going to make the background color, purple, and make the text white so we can see it. And then the other thing that we're going to do, so we'll save that and Grunt will go do its work, but we'll also go into the twig template here and we'll make these H2s. So make the content, whoops, actually I went up too high. Both the label and the content H2s. Whoops. All right, so if we save that, it's going out. It saw there was a change in the component twig template. It's going to go rebuild the style guide, clear the cache. So hopefully we can see those same changes. So if we reload the site here, we see that it's now got its purple background and the text is a little bit bigger. And if we look at the style guide, we'll also see the same thing. And we also see that the markup in the style guide here that was generated has been updated. So we got the H2s there as well. So there's, I think, a lot of refinement on my part to be able to use that in practice. And I think that there's, some challenges there in how you're going to bundle up your JavaScript that might have, again, some kind of Drupal-specific practices in there. Questions about how we would, this is obviously a very simple component, how we would use them in a more complicated way that might have components inside components. But it is really cool to be able to see this up on its feet, at least from my perspective, of you're just changing it in one place, and it updates in Drupal and updates in your style guide. So I'm really excited to see where the community is going to be going with this and how we can keep getting closer to this ideal. So related to that, there is an issue that is kind of the main focus point of the component-based rendering initiative, so you can see what a lot of the discussion is there. There's also a Drupal Twig Slack channel and components channel also in there if you want to follow along. But there's definitely a lot of stuff going on, a lot of things you can try and help out with, even if it is along the lines of just trying out some of these concepts and seeing if they work for you and make sense for you. All right, so we have barely just a little tiny bit of time for some questions. Yes?
So who in your project team then owns the style? It seems like that asset may transition to a different owner than traditionally owns it in a development project or design project.
Yeah, so that actually is something that has been still a bit of a point of discussion that we haven't completely finalized on. But if you say that as part of your workflow, when you define the look and feel of these components, they should just go into the style guide and it gets built. Basically, whenever the site changes, the style guide needs to be maintained. So for us, it's more of a question of, what are we going to do with that style guide then? Is it something that we're going to share publicly? Is it something we're going to share with clients? Is this particular presentation of a style guide something that's useful to a client, or does a designer need to get in somewhere and make it more client-friendly? So that's been more the question for us. I find that if we just treat this as a tool that's useful for the development workflow, we can just do it and then figure out how we want to use it outside of the project.
But then like your fancy client-facing style guide your designer might use, developers might not even use it. They use that.
Yep. Yeah, and I mean, the honest answer is it's still a evolving discussion, but what I advocate for is basically that you should be using whatever is the most real thing that exists. So in the beginning, it might be mock-ups or Photoshop files, but as those actually get implemented, so it's like it's a nice little assembly line. When the Photoshop version exists, you might build it out and put it in the style guide, but it hasn't been implemented yet. So that's still the realest thing that people should be referencing. And then eventually they'll get implemented, and there's a thing on the site. And the thing on the site might be the thing that you're referencing. So yeah, my personal opinion is that you should always be trying to use the thing that is the closest to real. And even if it's a matter of like taking screenshots of those things, and that's what goes into the PSD or PDF style guide for the client, that's still good enough. Make sense? Yeah.
I think mine's a continuation of that question.
This one's gonna go on forever.
But you made your visual regression tests on your local computer, and it dumps the things into your local computer. Is that something that you do on like a staging server or a test server, and like automate that process?
Yeah.
So others can see what you're doing?
Yep. So the baselines in this particular workflow would go into the repository so people can test against it. And then the output. So first of all, you can make this part of like a continuous integration process so that it's part of the test suite that runs. Having like a headless browser like Phantom.js that can run in like easily in a Linux environment makes that achievable. And then there are definitely tools like, I actually haven't used it, but similar to what Wraith does, there's a WebDriver CSS admin panel that gives you this little report and has the little cool drag seam diff kind of thing. I haven't set this up myself, but you could certainly set this up somewhere that people can take a look at.
I think we all like your dream.
It's good. I'll keep you guys up to date on what my other dreams are. Probably not. I actually submitted a lot of them. Did not get accepted. Cool. Any other questions or anything? Awesome. Thanks, guys. It was a lot of fun.